A restoration took place in the days of Josiah, king of Judah. He sought to restore the practices of the law of Moses that had been abandoned. We read in 2 Kings 23, the first 3 verses, "Then the king sent, and they gathered to him all the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, and the priests and the prophets and all the people, both small and great, and he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which was found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, and to carry out the words of this covenant which were written in this book. And all the people entered into the covenant." An effort began in the 19th century in this country to restore the New Testament church. We often refer to this effort as the Restoration Movement. It was a call for people to leave the churches of men and to forsake the creeds of men. The restorers encouraged people to follow the Scriptures as their only rule of faith and practice, and then unite upon the Word of God alone. Friends, it's not easy to give up what one has been taught or to leave those with whom one has had fellowship, but many did. Josiah's example helps us to see how we can have the courage to restore whatever may be lacking in our service to God. Josiah became king when he was only 8 years old. And what would have happened to make a young boy king? Well, it took some pretty unusual circumstances. First off, his father was assassinated in 2 Kings 21 and verse 23. Then the people, rather than submitting to the would-be usurpers of the throne, rebelled against these conspirators, killed them, and made the young son of Ammon king in his place. Josiah didn't have an ideal upbringing besides the fact that his father was killed by the time he was 8 years old. His father had done evil in the sight of the Lord. His grandfather Manasseh was an exceedingly wicked man, even to the point of sacrificing his own child as a burnt offering to a pagan god. He was so evil that despite his grandson Josiah's reforms, God still destroyed Judah because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him, 2 Kings 23:26. Josiah did not have the type of upbringing that would tend to produce faithfulness at such a young age. But despite all of this, Josiah had a good heart. He was interested in spiritual things, which led him to repair the house of the Lord. His tender heart made him receptive to the Word of God and inclined to obey it. However, the nation had departed far from the truth, and the book of the law had been lost. Therefore, it had not been observed. The Passover had to be reinstituted. The idols, mediums, and spirits had to be removed from the land. And sin and immorality were widespread, including the presence of prostitutes and child sacrifices being used as a form of worship to their gods. But why did this take courage? Folks, this nation had a long way to go to return to the Lord and His ways, and because of this, Josiah needed courage to restore the practices which God commanded and the purity that He demanded of His people. First, Josiah needed to change. Though one could easily argue that Josiah was better than most of the others, he still needed to return to the Lord himself, and the book of God's law had been lost. Therefore, he, as well as the nation as a whole, needed to correct the sins that they had been committing in ignorance. Second, Josiah had to combat tradition. By the time the book of the law was found, the erroneous practices that existed in the land had been going on for a while. Some dated back to the reign of Solomon. And it's often difficult to combat tradition, even when it's wrong, because some people become accustomed to it and become tolerant of it. Third, Josiah had to go against what his family had done. Both his father and his grandfather were evil men, and rather than following in their footsteps, he needed to observe their sins and not do likewise. Fourth, Josiah had to oppose the errorist. This was not just about Josiah making up his own mind to change his life. He had to mount a real opposition against real people. And truth is often easier to accept in theory than it is in practice, particularly when it comes to opposing those who are enemies of the truth. And then fifth, Josiah had to submit to a higher law. He was the king, but he was not above the law, especially God's law. Some rulers today believe that they are the ultimate authority, but Josiah recognized his responsibility to do what all he must do, and that is obey God. When Josiah found the book of the law and discovered that the nation was not keeping the commandments of God, he could have simply chosen to ignore it. He could have given preference to tradition, family ties, or any number of other things in order to compromise the word. Instead, he chose to side with God and restore the practices and purity of service according to his law. And friends, we must have the courage that Josiah had to look honestly and humbly at the word of God. And if we find that we too have fallen short in certain areas, then we must make whatever corrections are necessary. Friends, we thank you for joining us for our program today, and have a blessed day.